We are back again. This is work session number 3 out of 5 that we have planned. Here's just an overview of what we're going to talk about today for the update to the SSP. Actually, I do not anticipate us getting through all of these things. It's just this is what we have coming up. So hopefully we can get through 4.8 through 4.16. So we can conclude the schools element of this, and that will leave the impact tax and recordation tax for one of our work sessions next week. In fact, our plan for next week is to have some representatives from the Department of Finance as well as the Office of Management and Budget here to talk about the fiscal impact of some of these impact tax and recordation tax recommendations that we have in here. So next week will be a good time for the conversation on those. So with that, I want to go back to where we were when we left off last time on schools 2 weeks ago, which was talking about the residential development moratorium. So we did make it through this first recommendation on this, which I'm just going to highlight this kind of quickly here, and then we'll get into the next part, which is starting to talk about the exceptions to the moratorium. So this recommendation, 4.8, essentially indicates that we would allow the automatic moratorium. We would continue to have an automatic moratorium in the greenfield impact areas, meaning that the planning board could not approve any preliminary plan of subdivision for residential uses in an area that's under moratorium unless it met certain exceptions, and we'll talk about those exceptions today. And, you know, as part of that, we talked a lot about how that greenfield area is behaving differently than our infill and our turnover impact areas. We did review these comments. We had a lot of comments on the residential development moratorium, and this is really just a summary of them. I did want to note that earlier this week we provided the planning board with staff's tracking spreadsheet. This has also been posted to the public agenda. So for those of you who are watching remotely, I just want to mention that the spreadsheet is a living document. We received many emails yesterday that have not all necessarily been added to the spreadsheet. There are many comments that we've received from multiple people, same comments from multiple people or organizations. And in those cases, we may not have listed each individual name, but rather identified the comment as coming from multiple people. But we will continue to update that spreadsheet and post it to the agenda each week with the additional comments received and additional responses from staff as we can get through those. We'll try to highlight the ones that are new so people can find the things that have been added each time. So I'm not going to go through each of these particular sets of comments here again, but we did receive comments in favor of and against this recommendation. Some of those that were against feel that we should eliminate the moratorium completely across the entire county. Others that were against it felt that we shouldn't eliminate it from anywhere. Others talked about maybe, you know, in the areas where we've eliminated the moratorium, that automatic moratorium, maybe we should have an emergency threshold for extreme situations, something such as the examples provided on this last bullet here, this last row, with 150% utilization, or if an individual school exceeded 120% for, let's say, 3 years in a row. So these were some creative solutions that other people had suggested. Some more comments here. Some new ones that I think have been added to this. I did want to address briefly, this comment here that the board heard an overwhelming amount of testimony rejecting moratoria and instead suggesting that the moratoria be eliminated entirely. I will say that was this comment is fairly consistent with a lot of the testimony that we heard in the public hearing. However, we have also received a great deal of recommendations encouraging us to maintain a great deal of comments encouraging us to maintain the moratorium in those greenfield impact areas as well as across the entire county. Many of the comments we've received have said things like, don't eliminate the moratorium without have something else in place to help guarantee the adequate infrastructure. We believe that we have recommended something in the form of the utilization premium payments in place of those in areas where we no longer have moratorium. There was also a comment that we received recently, given the most recent COVID-19 experience, providing housing opportunities in greenfield impact areas will allow for more single-family attached and detached units with more space. Why stymie this type of growth? I just think that I would highlight this as being really interesting, considering that we've talked a lot for decades now about trying to get away from, what would otherwise be considered sprawl and having more space. And it's just very interesting to see the dynamic that is coming into play with under the current pandemic. So these are things that we talked about previously, just kind of highlighting the distinct difference that you see coming out of the greenfield impact areas in terms of population growth, housing growth, and student growth, and that we've also been able to make a connection between the student enrollment growth that we're seeing in this area is directly a result of the new development, whereas in the turnover and infill areas, a lot of the the enrollment growth that we're seeing in those areas is coming from the turnover, not so much from new development. And we had this chart where we talked about how it's constant MCPS playing catch-up in this area, in the Clarksburg area. This is the Clarksburg Elementary School cluster, and you can see the red shows you the utilization across the entire cluster for elementary schools, and the dark blue is every time that they've added capacity. So we've received some testimony about how Clarksburg Elementary School number 9 has been delayed, and that is a school that is intended to help relieve Clarksburg Elementary School, which is projected to be over 200% capacity. And yes, the elementary school number 9 was delayed, I believe, by a year. It's expected now to open in 2023. But that's not to say that MCPS hasn't been doing things in this area. You can see that, in 2009, a new elementary school, William B. Gibbs Junior Elementary School, opened. In 2011, Fox Chapel Elementary School had a 10-classroom addition. In 2014, Wilson Wims Elementary School opened. And what's not shown on here is in 2019, Snowden Farms Elementary School opened. So there is a continuous kind of effort to build additional capacity in this area. And so this is something that we're going to add this all the way through so that when we come back and circle back on all of this, we can kind of summarize the comments that we took away from our previous discussions with the board to hopefully make it easier for you to make decisions on each of these. So this is just our summary of the board's discussion. General support for this recommendation. There was some concern that maintaining a moratorium in the greenfield impact areas would curtail new housing in the one part of the county where it is more affordable to purchase a single-family home, and whether or not there could be exceptions to allow affordable inventory to be built in those areas, not just MPDUs. And then there seemed to be an interest in preventing moratorium even in the greenfield areas where surplus school capacity in nearby schools was available. And so it was actually with that we prepared some potential language for an additional exception to the moratorium that could be added. And I'm not going to get into that one just yet. I want to talk about the other exceptions first, but just wanted to see if there was anything else that the board wanted to highlight or comment on the record at this point on the moratorium in general here before we go into the exceptions to it.
Yeah, Jerry Sushi, just that one exception that you mentioned, and that kind of, as I recall, came up in West Clarksburg there, and the issue was high school capacity, and the option that the school board could say, and it came up, they had perhaps capacity down there at the new Seneca High School and running a high school bus service down there, down Route 121. So the provision that if the school board said, we're trying to fill some classrooms that aren't filled, and we would be willing to accept students, say, from that Greenfields area, that could be an option, or would the school board be open to that, or could we have that in our planning process?
Well, we do have Ms. McGuire here from MCPS who could talk to that, but I think that, we talked about this briefly last time too, that they recently went through their boundary study for this area, and there was a recommended boundary change, and that is being implemented this fall. And so the likelihood of doing another boundary change in that same area immediately afterwards and just to know that those studies take about a year for them to evaluate, and I think that's the study that is being implemented now incorporated something like 14 different options that the superintendent and the Board of Education were evaluating. I don't know if Essie, if you had anything else you wanted to add on that.
Thank you. Yes, I would just like to highlight that, as you were saying, for the board to reassign student assignment and change boundaries is actually a full process. And so, as Jason was saying, we did an extensive process that involves, and it is governed by our policy and regulation. And there are legal requirements around that as well. And so it is something that if the board is going to revisit, again, there would need to be that process for it. The board would need to adopt a resolution indicating that it wanted a new boundary study. So it's not, it isn't that we could identify one area and make that isolated decision. It does have to be part of that larger context. And I do also want to correct that Seneca Valley is not going to have extra room. We actually, even though again, the math didn't line up that we could solve all of the capacity problems with one facility. We, again, did the most that we were able to do and accomplish all of the goals that are outlined in the policy, knowing that we would need secondary relief for both Clarksburg and Northwest. But Seneca Valley is projected to be very close to its capacity. It's a challenged site that won't be able to accommodate relocatables, and so we don't feel that there is room there to add additional students, or we certainly would have done that.
Okay, thank you.
And this is Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. Just to clarify, when Essie McGuire says the board, she means the school board.
Right.
Not the planning board.
Right.
I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. I'll try
no power over you, which I'm kind of happy, actually. I'm just going to add, Jason, the previous slide that you have, that one, I think this is a great slide that sums up everything that we need to know in this area, especially that sentence where you say construction of new schools cannot keep pace with rapidly increasing enrollment caused by new development. And I think, like, to me, and I said it last time we talked, I stand by your recommendation. I think it should remain as it is. And we have a responsibility of making sure we have money to create the infrastructure that we need in these neighborhoods. And I know you're gonna go on and give some other suggestions based on previous board recommendations, but I just want to state right now that I think we should leave it just as you wrote it, personally. So that's it.
Thank you.
I'm gonna have a few things to say about this, but I think now might be a good time to hear from some of our callers, because I suspect that some of what they have to say may be relevant to this moratorium issue. So at this point, I want to invite Melissa McKenna. If she's ready to speak, now would be a good time.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Anderson, for allowing me to speak. As far as this proposed moratorium exception for nearby capacity, I strongly oppose it unless and until the Board of Education will consider such relief and act accordingly. It's an option that will not be used, and the students will only suffer further. I thank Mr. Sartori for the Gaithersburg Elementary School example on the previous work session. That leads to my second objection. 10 network miles is too far. Laytonsville Elementary is 6.9 miles by driving away from Gaithersburg Elementary. To relieve Clarksburg Elementary would require busing past many other schools already over capacity in the cluster to either Damascus or 7.6 miles away to Monocacy Elementary. So neither are too viable. The third objection is using a school that has a utilization rate already at 110% over capacity. I believe only schools at 80% capacity should be considered. And what about high schools? As you mentioned, Clarksburg High School is now the next main sticking point. By adding a 500-seat CTE program to Seneca Valley High School, MCPS reduced the seats available to relieve Clarksburg and Northwest from 1,300 to 800. So that was part of why the math didn't work as it was originally intended. So Clarksburg will still be, as you said, close to moratorium, and Northwest is now waiting for what will have to be domino relief from Crown High School. This exception also comes down to decisions that are outside your control. Program moves by the Board of Education are now more common and have resulted in accelerated overcrowding at the receiving schools, such as Page and Mill Creek Town elementary schools. These program moves also destabilize the reliability of school capacity over time. Additionally, a policy revision to FAA-RA by the Board of Education a few years ago aligned class size with staffing practice for a class size reduction or focus schools. So in some cases, there was a considerable increase in capacity, at least on paper, but without any actual increase in physical space. Beyond that, there are also county council funding decisions. Despite Clarksburg Elementary School at 200% of capacity, as Mr. Sartori mentioned, Clarksburg Elementary number 9 was delayed again, and the answer for that is lack of funding and also priority being given to projects like Woodward and Crown High Schools to avoid moratorium. So they're all tied together. However, it does also emphasize that the uncertainty of a project until it's in the first 2 years of the CIP in which construction funding is guaranteed. So for me, that emphasizes the usefulness of this 3-year annual school test. To all of this, I would just say staging as part of the subdivision staging policy. If there would be development staging requirements, like there were milestones for White Flint 1, Shady Grove, and the Life Sciences Center, so that you can pause, and that would allow school infrastructure at least to catch up. And we saw that with that graph in Clarksburg. My last option for consideration is, after discussing it with MCPS, is possibly capping schools. So they would be closed to new development, sending those schools to an alternate, less crowded school, but still allowing neighborhood students and turnover. So again, if you're going to consider it, I really think it's a risky prospect if the Board of Education won't actually do it, and the distance is too far. So thank you.
Thank you. Kaya Marin, are you there?
Hi there.
Hello.
Thank you. So I had some comments I submitted. I'm not going to read through them. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. And Natalie, I just want to give you a shout out. Those comments and the grid was a great idea. So thank you for that. I think that this exception, if you are going to have greenfield moratorium, is a bad idea. I think that you should not be writing exceptions to accommodate specific developments, and that you should be writing the policy for a cohesive and entire policy and not already undermining it. I know that for a few weeks you've been working to approve a couple of specific projects, and I don't think that's an appropriate way to work on this. I do think you should be working with MCPS, and that was a recommendation from the Urban Land Institute, and it was throughout their report. There are a few other objections I have to this exemption, and the first is that it was written with a school that's over capacity by 10%, which in the case of a high school could be 250 students. Also that it could be up to an hour away if it is 10 miles and rush hour. Second, as Essie pointed out, it's not under your authority to change those boundaries, and it does require an extensive process. So to make approvals based on a change that's hypothetical is not appropriate. Lastly, I think that if you're talking about hypothetical capacity that you don't actually have, it opens the door to undermine the utilization premium payments, because if they're based on being at 120%, people will inevitably, if you have flexible boundaries, start pointing to the left and to the right, and will undermine your ability to collect those payments. Lastly, I just want to quote from a letter that MCPS wrote to you yesterday, urging you to, quote, maintain and implement policy elements that acknowledge the intent of the law to provide needed public systems infrastructure commensurate with development. And it's lacking from this policy overall, but more importantly, it's lacking from your conversations, and I hope that you'll continue to focus on adequate infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy Calhoun.
So hello. I'm not good on the fly, and my testimony covers a bunch of different topics, so I'm just going to start if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Good afternoon, and I thank you, Chairman Anderson, for the opportunity to speak today. And I just want to talk about the growth policy. Within the document itself, it says that the subdivision staging policy, one of the many ways Montgomery planning helps to preserve the excellent quality of life in Montgomery County, is based on having sufficient infrastructure to support growth. Currently, we do not have sufficient infrastructure, schools, to support the continued growth in our county, and the recommendations put forth do not change that. I believe that if the Planning Board approves the policy recommendations for growth, our schools will become even more overcrowded by allowing school enrollment at 120% capacity as the norm rather than the exception, and more dilapidated by reducing scarce and critical MCPS CIP funding to repair them. I'm still wondering why we're even discussing these changes in fees without having a financial analysis. There are many good ideas in this SSP that Jason Sartori and his team worked hard on, and I testified about them 2 weeks ago. However, I'm here to express my continued disappointment with what I consider to be a flagrant oversight, moratoria and the norming of 120% school facility use. So 4.8, which eliminates the moratoria for 93% of the county without replacing it with any emergency stopgap for schools that are and will remain severely overcrowded with no solution in sight. I have to ask you, how does that help preserve the excellent quality of life in Montgomery County? 412, that the board is allowed to greenlight development where a school is at 120% capacity. A school that's at 120% capacity is not adequate for current residents, let alone additional ones. And indiscriminately adding more students also does not preserve the excellent quality of life in Montgomery County. At a minimum, there should be a specific rubric for the board to use to deny or approve a residential development project in any area with adequate public school infrastructure. And 416, waiting until 120% school capacity to impose utilization premium payments flies in the face of the purpose of the SSP. Even with those payments, the money arrives too late to address current overcrowding, much less prepare for new students. If we are to preserve the excellent quality of life in Montgomery County, we need to fund and build capacity solutions sooner. Portables arrive on the scene at the earliest point of overcrowding. And even though they're supposed to be a temporary solution, and guess what? They cost money too. And I have to add, based on an earlier comment, that these utilization premium payments do not do the same thing as moratoria. So to say that they're going to take the place and solve the problem, I think is disingenuous. And I say all of this knowing that the Planning Board is reviewing the Thrive 2050 plan, and that encourages schools in every community for every age group within a 15-minute walk. Mm-hmm. How will this policy help to meet those goals? And why consider adjacent clusters for capacity? How is a long bus ride to a school 10 miles away remotely comparable with a 15-minute walk? And how would utilizing a school that is 110% over capacity relieve overcrowding? And how will any of that preserve that excellent quality of life in Montgomery County? I have to say, I've moved beyond disappointment to anger. I'm angry that these recommendations do not take seriously the obligations of this Planning Board and the SSP to the children of this county. Their need for adequate infrastructure, schools. Please fix this. Our children are counting on you. Please do right by them. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned, I have a few things to say about this. I want to point out that first of all, that the recent WXY boundary report documented that there are 26 elementary schools, 6 middle schools, and 2 high schools that are adjacent to schools that have significantly different capacity levels than they do. That is to say, schools which are over capacity next to schools that are under capacity. In addition, that report documented that only 66% of MCPS students currently attend the school that is closest to their home. So the idea that moving boundaries or students in a way that they would be required to go to a school that's not the one that is closest to where they live is very much part of the current arrangement, which has been created by MCPS itself. In addition to the WXY report, Growing East County, the blog that Sebastian Smoot, who's a neighborhood activist in Burtonsville area, runs, has put up maps. I believe Planning Department actually has produced very similar maps showing graphically the extent to which there are many, many schools in the system, not just in Clarksburg, although it's true in Clarksburg as well, where there are schools that have capacity that are adjacent to schools that are overcrowded by the metrics that we in the school system use to measure capacity constraints. In addition, there's a very good post in Greater Greater Washington documenting the thousands of empty seats that MCPS has throughout the system, despite the fact that there are many schools that are extremely overcrowded. So I believe our responsibility is to make sure that infrastructure can keep pace with growth. It is not our responsibility to make sure that that infrastructure is actually used to accommodate the students that it should serve. That is within the hands of MCPS. And on that score, I think a lot of the testimony we just heard just proves the point why it is not appropriate to expect the SSP to simply follow whatever MCPS's decisions are about the use of its own school capacity. If the school capacity exists, I don't think that it's the planning department's responsibility or the planning board's responsibility to expect that we're going to control whether the school system uses it efficiently or effectively to meet the needs, whether that's through boundary changes or some other means. And on that point, I want to point out that OLO wrote a memorandum report that's OLO Memorandum Report 2017-10. It's dated June 13th, 2017, which discusses a number of these issues about school capacity utilization. In that report, OLO described several options in addition to boundary changes, including COSA liberalization, conversion of non-classroom space, lease space, et cetera. They listed 4 or 5 options which would allow MCPS to address capacity constraints through means other than portables and other than immediate additions to CIP projects for construction of new schools. So it's not as though there are no options available. I mean, boundary changes are the obvious ones. I think that, you know, in the case of Seneca Valley and Clarksburg High School, while it's true that the projections put Seneca Valley, I think, at 98% within the time horizon that's relevant for the SSP, which is close to theoretically 100% of capacity, I don't think it is realistic to say that we should pretend that that school is close to what its practical limits are, especially in relation to a high school right next door, which is right on the brink of 120% of capacity. So I don't want to tell MCPS how to do its job, but I also don't believe that this board can be in the position of simply accepting whatever MCPS's decisions are about how they use the classroom buildings that actually exist in the real world, to be blind to the fact that there is capacity that's available in an adjacent cluster. And I think in particular this idea that's been suggested many times, and I heard it just now, we should be working with MCPS. Well, that is a two-way street. MCPS did not consult with us, not that I would have expected them to, about the boundary change between Clarksburg and the new, larger Seneca Valley. But not having been included in that decision-making, it is a big problem for the county, not just real estate developers, but the county, to meet its housing goals if a boundary change can abruptly move a cluster that was, until just a few months ago, showing capacity that was sufficient to accommodate the development applications that were in the process of review, and now suddenly is right at the brink of being in moratorium. And I'll say just one more thing to kind of summarize, which is I agree that the point of the SSP is to make sure there's sufficient infrastructure to support growth. But as I've spilled a lot of ink on our blog to explain this idea in excruciating detail, housing is infrastructure. Schools are infrastructure. Roads are infrastructure. All these things are important forms of infrastructure which support our quality of life. And while we all recognize children need a place to sit in a classroom to go to school, it's also true that the children and their parents need a place to live. Or we have major, major problems with the affordability of housing, which is not only bad for the individual families that can't afford a place to live, or at least afford a place that suits their needs, it's also a major economic development problem. And that challenges our ability to maintain the workforce we need for our economy to be competitive, to maintain our tax base. And ultimately, if the policy that we adopt results in a building moratorium, that does not produce new revenue for schools or any of the other needs that we have. Every house, apartment, townhouse, et cetera, that is constructed not only generates whatever the impact fees turn out to be, but also property taxes for every year after they're sold into perpetuity to the tune of over 50 cents on the dollars going straight back to MCPS. So development is, in fact, a major important source of revenue, tax revenue, that benefits MCPS, both its capital and operating budgets, directly. And saying, let's not have any more development until the schools catch up, I don't think really works in the context of a situation where there is school capacity available in an adjacent cluster. So I think that we really have very little choice but to try to find a way to avoid moratoria, not because we are trying to favor any particular real estate project, but because it's important for the economic well-being of the county in every respect, including our ability to pay for public schools. That's my piece. Thank you for hearing me out on that. Are there any other comments or questions from the board on this particular point?
Jerry Sishi, well said, Casey. I would agree with you that the development does provide the revenue to do the things that we need to do. So I think coming to some kind of consensus would be great.
If nobody else has anything on this point right away, maybe Jason wants to pick it up again and get us into the specifics.
Sure. Okay.
See, Essie seems to want to say something. Go right ahead.
Thank you. I did want to just clarify a few points, if that's okay. So, you know, I think certainly boundary studies and making boundary decisions is a very complex issue. And again, the Board of Education has policy and regulation that governs that. And one of the things that we do look for when we make boundary decisions is actually to look ahead a little bit. Rather than making a boundary decision every year to change small groups of students to where there may be some small amount of space here or there, we really are looking for a boundary change that will sustain over time and allow students and families some stability of that assignment over time, as well as allow communities and other planning efforts to move forward in a way that they can anticipate some predictability in the future. And so that's part of our challenge, which is certainly while there are areas where, as you point out, there are additional seats that are unfilled, those areas sometimes are adjacent to other areas where a decision could be made to extend capacity over time. And sometimes when we look ahead, what we see is that actually there's going to be something coming in behind it. And so we don't want to create a future logjam for ourselves and for that community and for that school. And that really is the challenge, because in a number of places where our empty seats are often not where we know that those next rounds of growth are going to be. Certainly funding limitations play an additional part. And again, the Board of Education appreciates the economic development interest that the Planning Board is working to put forward. But certainly our focus on the educational stability going forward and how we want those programs to operate in different areas is entirely within the Board of Education's purview. And I do just want to emphasize that, again, those policy considerations do look to extend to a future planning aspect when it comes to the capacity of the buildings. One of the pieces that our policy does not envision is that there would be small movements of groups of students over time. And certainly our policy is not to add students to a building that is either approaching its full capacity or over its full capacity. And so those are measures that I think the Board of Education would certainly look at as not long-term sustainable and potentially counter, solving one problem and creating another is not the intent of our policy either. I just wanted to sort of clarify that perspective on the use of our buildings.
All right. Well, I am glad to hear your clarifications. I guess I stand by what I said about this OLO report. They made a whole bunch of recommendations, and I'm not aware that MCPS has adopted any of them except finally agreeing that we need to look at boundary changes comprehensively, including COSA liberalization, which seems to me to be a short-term fix where you could deal with a few handful of students without destabilizing or involving any involuntary change in who's going to what school at all. I could think of a few others myself, but I'm just going to stick to what the OLO said because that's been sitting out there for 3 years now, and I'm not, as I said, if anybody has acted on any of those, I haven't heard about it.
Well, and actually that's interesting because actually we have, and again, 3 years, as you know, in the planning world is a fairly short turnaround time for a capital program. But we actually have a number of examples where we are looking at boundaries, where we are moving programs or relocating programs in order to make those kinds of accommodations to facilities. It is a jigsaw puzzle, as I'm sure you appreciate. And so again, those pieces do have to come together and do have to be interlaid over time.
Okay, well, I think I've said my piece. I'm not sure what any of that has to do with COSAs, but we can... Oh,
I can address the COSA piece as well, which is, again, certainly student transfers are a complicated policy issue as well. The board did discuss the impact of the COSA policy, of enrollment and capacity on the COSA policy. So that is a conversation that's been ongoing, but again, in the context of other student transfer issues, which also relate to transportation. They also relate to other opportunities within the system. So again, that is also a jigsaw puzzle that the board is working to put together.
Okay, I'll let you have the last word. Go ahead, Jason.
All right. I'm going to reshare my screen and turn that back on. Okay. So, all right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the moratorium exceptions. And let me get this up here. All right. So you will see there is some slight wording change that we're suggesting to this recommendation as it was written in the working draft, the public hearing draft. And this is quite honestly, we had this changed wording in our presentation. I think we failed to move this into the document at one point. And it was interesting because we were actually called out on a couple of these things by some people who looked really closely at the policy, and we realized, well, we had made that change, but clearly we had not. So this is simply to kind of, we tried to simplify this recommendation. So exceptions to the residential development moratorium will include projects estimated to net fewer than one student at a school in moratorium and projects where the residential component consists entirely of senior living units. So right now, we have a de minimis exception in the current SSP, and that exception, we've had this for a while, is 3 units or less. Now, we've always treated that as net. It wasn't necessarily very clear, but we've always treated that as net, meaning if a project would build 4 units and they were tearing down 1, the net would be 3 units or less. That project could still come before the planning board for approval in an area that's in moratorium. The odd thing is that with our student generations rates being what they are, 3 units or less is pretty much always going to generate 0 students. And so the thought was we shouldn't be basing the de minimis exception on the number of units, but based on the number of students it would generate. And so our recommendation here is to now tie it to the actual school impact. And we say that it could not generate a full student at the school that's in moratorium. So if it's the high school that's in moratorium, it's okay if the project would generate a single elementary school student, because the elementary school is not in moratorium. But if the high school is in moratorium, it couldn't generate a single student at the high school. And just to give you a sense of how this translates into the number of units, you could see that in most cases here it's the same as what we currently do, which is 3 units or less. The only one would be single-family detached. It would would generate two single-family detached units would generate a single elementary school student in our Greenfield area. So, but for these other types, single-family attached, multifamily, and even single-family detached, when you're talking about middle school or high school, you can get more units. And so we did consider higher thresholds, but once you start, doubling, you say no more than 2 students or 3 students, you're actually talking about a significant number of units that would be allowed. So given that this only applies to the Greenfield impact area, where new development is the leading cause of school overcrowding, we felt that this was an acceptable limit to say that it should not generate more than, shouldn't generate any students at all. And we did receive some comments on this. ULI and NAOP supported this recommendation. There was one comment we received that thought that fewer than 1 student was too high, that it actually should be fewer than a half of the students. So it would cut the de minimis in half or so. There was also a suggestion, I believe this was from MCCPTA, that we should track these exceptions so that we can be aware of what is and we can report on that, which I think makes sense. And this idea that the de minimis exception should be clear and interpreted as net additional students, which is part of the correction we made to that. And that's all I had on this particular one. I don't know if you have any comments on this.
This is Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. I already made my comment, so.
Okay. All right, we
carry on.
Yep. Okay. So moving on. So now here is the exception that you heard a few of the people who spoke earlier talk about. This was really this was not included in the working draft. This is some suggested language for a recommendation prepared by planning staff in response to the board's conversation during work session number 1. So here is the specific, potential text that we put in our staff report for this item, just as, to kind of give a sense of how this would potentially work. But the idea here is that what we're saying is areas would still go into moratorium, but if a school at the same level, elementary, middle, or high school, that has that is in moratorium, is located within a particular distance of the proposed subdivision, and it meets certain adequacy standards, that it would be okay for the board to provide an exception to the moratorium for that development application. Now, what this really does is it generates a good number of questions that would need to be considered if this was an exception that you wanted to recommend adding to the policy. First, I would just say that in general, we have some concerns that this renders the moratorium tool moot in an area where it can still be helpful. And you'll see that when you get into, we have some maps that show you what these different commute sheds are for the 10 miles, and we also have 5 miles. But so that's one of the questions that you have just generally, is this exception appropriate? And you can see that we've received a lot of comments from people in the community indicating they don't think that it is. Then the question would be, what is the appropriate distance? Is it 5 miles? Is it 10 miles? Is it different by school level? You can go 10 miles and maybe get to one other high school, but you might go 10 miles and get to 8 different elementary schools. So maybe 10 miles is too much at the elementary school level. And one question I have on this is whether or not there's any guidance from MCPS in terms of how far they typically like to see students traveling to school, right? So that might provide some guidance to the planning board in terms of setting that number here, this 10 network miles, whether it should be something different. And then the question is, what is the appropriate adequacy standards from the lending school? So these, again, we just kind of put this out here as a starting point for conversation. But, you know, you heard that people are concerned about using 110% as the standard, as saying that, oh, this school has available capacity because it's less than 110%. And, you know, as SC indicated, MCPS won't really make a decision to proactively move students to a school that is already over capacity, and they probably shouldn't. And so is 110% correct? You heard Ms. McKenna indicate that she thought it should be between 80 and 90%. So these are some of the questions, things that you need to consider as part of this. I did want to show you, based on the 10-mile shed that we put in the draft of this, here is, you know, what you're looking at is in purple is the Greenfield impact area. The Clarksburg High School cluster boundary is here in dark red. This is a 10-mile network mile shed, 10-mile shed from using our transportation network, our street network, from Damascus High School. And you can see Damascus High School largely covers actually covers the entire part of the Greenfield impact area that is Clarksburg High School. And Damascus is projected, I'll show you the projections here for their 3-year, 4-year, and 5-year projections. Now, Damascus also has in the 6th year a major capital project that will increase the size of it as well. And the thought is that that would provide the kind of a second round of relief to Clarksburg High School when that comes along, but it is currently outside the scope of the current SSP and also outside the scope of what we've proposed. Here is a 10-mile shed from Northwest High School, and it covers a good portion of Clarksburg. Poolsville really doesn't, so you can't really get to Poolsville High School from 10 miles of an area within the Clarksburg High School service area. Seneca Valley covers a good portion of Clarksburg High School within 10 miles, and Watkins Mill does as well. So, but again, here are the different utilization rates. All of these would fall under the 110% threshold. I mean, Northwest is just barely under it. But based on the recommendation of Ms. McKenna, if this were to go forward to look at between 80 and 90%, really Watkins Mill would be the one that provides the needed relief in terms of this exception. If we look at all of them combined, you can see it's really difficult to tell here, but the entire area is covered. And so this is where we say, as we had written it, at 10 miles at 110%, it kind of renders the moratorium moot. And when you take those same distances and apply them to elementary schools, where you've got elementary schools all throughout here, again, you will undoubtedly cover the entire area. And so there would always be an exception to the moratorium. If we cut it to 5-mile shed, it's a slightly different story. So you can see Damascus now doesn't cover the entire Clarksburg when we only look at 5 miles. Northwest doesn't get into Clarksburg at all. Poolsville still doesn't. Seneca Valley cuts into a little bit of it, and Watkins Mill just barely here. So, one thought could be somewhere in the middle, but I wanted to be able to show you the maps and also just to kind of make the point of how difficult this is. Where it seems really simple to say, let's allow borrowing, we need to think about, well, exactly what would be allowed? How far does it need to be? What is an acceptable level of adequacy at the school that we're borrowing from? And the comments that we've received, we put this out last Thursday, and in short order, we received countless comments from up-county residents and others across the county who are adamantly opposed to this idea. The only support for the exception has come from 3 developer interests with projects that could be delayed due to potential moratorium in the Clarksburg area. The comments received suggest that there is a huge lack of confidence in the system among Clarksburg residents and a major lack of trust in developers and their legal teams, which are seen as, quote, pushing every boundary to manipulate the system. Some of the more specific comments shown here include the second one that suggests that boundary changes are easy. They are not. They don't happen in this way, so why should the policy be based on the assumption that they do or will happen? And I would note that this is not entirely true. As Ms. McGuire did indicate, we're fully aware of a boundary study now to reassign students from Somerset Elementary School to Westbrook Elementary School in Bethesda without adding capacity at either of the schools. So while this change, it's being pursued to remedy overcrowding at Somerset, in general, we haven't seen many of those types of activities happen, but here's an example of where it's actually going to happen in the next year or so. It may be something that happens more frequently in the future. Other comments relate to the related to the specifics of the proposed exception. You heard it from some of the folks today. 10 miles is too far. The pending boundary change is being challenged in court for creating trips to school that are even shorter than 10 miles. And as you saw on the maps, 10 miles covers the entire cluster with possible exceptions. Covers the entire Clarksburg cluster with a possible exception, rendering the moratorium tool useless. And that was only at the high school level. There are many more middle schools and elementary schools in the area. But if you go forward with this exception, you may want to consider a shorter distance for high schools and even shorter distances for middle schools or elementary schools. And then the other point here was that the idea of borrowing from a school with a utilization rate of up to 110% seemed absurd to many people. A school at 110% is already overcrowded. Why should we count on MCPS reassigning students to a school that's already overcrowded? So all that said, an alternative approach to this, recognizing the very strong reaction from the community on this, and recognizing this is a little bit more complicated than I think people originally thought, would be to set a different adequacy threshold for moratorium. And this was another thing that we talked about last week, or 2 weeks ago, the idea of saying, well, maybe 120% is not the right threshold, maybe it should be 125%. And so I mentioned last time that we would, I think that I personally would be comfortable with that type of shift, knowing if we were using the 3-year projections. And I created this just to kind of give a sense of what we're dealing with here. The blue line shows you the 120% threshold that we use today. And the blue range here, I actually used the numbers that were reported by a good number of people who wrote into us over the last week. It just gives you a sense of, well, when something is said to be expected to be at 120%, what is the likely range of where it will actually fall based on the reliability of the data historically? And so you can see a school that's projected to be at 120% in the 5th year could be as high as 131, 132%, could be as low as 109 or 8% or so. But at the 3-year, there's a smaller range here. So if we went up to 125%, and we went to 3 years, we're basically dealing with the same high end as what we would have dealt with at 5 years and 120%. So the point being that when we say 120% and we're using 5-year projections, we recognize that that could actually be as high as over 130%. If we go to a 3-year projection and we say 125%, it's basically saying the same thing, that it could be as high as a little over 130%. Obviously, if we went to 125% and looked at the 5-year, we're dealing with numbers that could be as high as really 140% by the time that 5th year comes around. So this was where I said that I think we would feel comfortable increasing that threshold, but really in conjunction with going to the 3-year projection.
Well,
that is all I had on that.
I just really doubt that anybody who opposes the idea of using adjacent capacity is going to support a higher moratorium threshold. I could be wrong, but it just doesn't seem likely to me.
Well, and the difference too is that this would set the new adequacy, and it could be that it's not for utilization premium payments. It could only apply in the greenfield areas for. This would be the measure for moratorium. It would still allow areas to go into moratorium, whereas the exception, as we put it out there last week, would basically not put any area ever in moratorium until you got to a point where all of the neighboring schools were all above 110%. And you could see there are a lot of neighboring schools that just at the high school level, there were, 5 that, come into play. So,
yeah, I just have to stop you there because we've got some comments that say, you guys are just trying to make sure no moratorium happens. And to that, I say, yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Like the object, this is not a game where the object is to force areas of the county into moratorium. The goal is to avoid moratorium. So we can have housing and we can also have school capacity. So a policy that achieves the goal of putting students in empty classroom seats or seats that would otherwise be empty and therefore avoids moratorium is a win-win, I think, for everybody. That's not some sort of evasion of the intent of the policy. Well, I'll let anybody else. I just wanted to mention a couple other things. One is that, I live across the street from where we're sitting right now, and Einstein High School is my home high school. It's 4.8 miles from here. Blair is only 2.1 miles from here. So MCPS, I think it's fair to say, again, only 66% of students are going to the closest school to where they live. MCPS routinely assigns students to schools that are some distance away from where they live, even in an urbanized area like the Down County. And I think those maps you showed are really illuminating that it's not just that Seneca Valley is well under a moratorium threshold, but there's basically 3 out of the 4 area high schools have some capacity, in some cases very substantial capacity. So I really don't see why we'd want to impose a moratorium when there is capacity in close range. I would concede that probably the distances involved should be shorter at the middle and elementary school level because there are more of those schools. They tend to be more proximate. And also I think it's less reasonable to ask people to be, ferrying their elementary or middle school children around. High school students tend to be a little bit more capable of getting themselves around and are more in a position to take even a longer bus ride. But I would suggest maybe like a 3-mile, 5-mile, and 10-mile threshold or something along those lines. The last thing I wanted to mention is I know that MCPS has in the past allocated or assigned specific developments to different clusters before the development actually was built or occupied. So that's outside of the normal boundary change process. And that's, for example, what happened with New Hampshire Greens and Key Middle School instead of Rosa Parks, where they would have gone if they'd been in the pre-existing boundary. So it's within MCPS's control to take a specific subdivision that's about to be built and say, when this subdivision is done, the students here will go to a different school, even though that subdivision is entirely included within a different cluster. So the MCPS has some flexibility short of wholesale boundary changes to reassign narrow geographies within a cluster for socioeconomic and racial diversity, and there's certainly no reason I don't think that they couldn't do it in order to take advantage of spare capacity that they have reasonably nearby. But I'll let everybody else weigh in now.
And this is Essie McGuire. Could I just clarify briefly? You're right, Mr. Anderson, that we could do that. I do want to clarify that it would still be a boundary change process. So it still would fall under the regulatory process that we were talking about that the Board of Education would need to follow.
Yeah, obviously MCPS would have to go through its whatever process it chooses to make those decisions, but it's been done, is the point. Even, and it wasn't, and in the case of a specific subdivision being carved out, you're not dealing with people who have settled expectations about which school they're going to be assigned to. You're talking about a subdivision that's newly built where nobody's moved in yet, so you presumably are not going to get the same kind of resistance because people we're in one school boundary and then you're telling them they got to be somewhere else. Jerry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Jason, the issue that the kind of West Clarksburg issue on the projects, they were not coming to be occupied in 2 years or 3 years. How does that, when you approve a project and just going through the design, all the other approvals would not be first occupants 2 or 3 years in the future? How does that play into it?
Sure. So we don't take into account when we do the adequate public facilities analysis for schools, we don't take into account any phasing. So even if a project anticipates building a certain number of units within 5 years and then 10 years and then fully 15 years or something, if they're getting their preliminary plan approval and seeking their adequate public facilities approval as well for all of the units, then we evaluate all of the units based on the test that's in place at that time. And if that test looks at the 5-year projection, that's what we use. It's not to say that we expect all of those students to come in during that 5 years or 3 years or whatever it might be. It's just that's what the test is.
Has that ever been considered to apply that kind of from a staging standpoint in development, and that would be a commitment from the developer? Yeah, we're really going to be selling in 2 years or 3 years.
So that would be, if there was a staging component that would be allowed, it would require them to come back for their next APF approval with each phase, right? And it would provide a certain level of uncertainty to the developer early on in the process, not knowing when they come back for their approval on the next phase, whether or not they'll get that approval.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be for the whole project starting in 2 or 3 years.
No, we didn't. Yeah, I mean, we know that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that's
considered. This is Gwen. I would just note that has been an issue. We have projects in completely different parts of the county, not Clarksburg, that got their adequate public facilities approval and have taken capacity, school capacity, and they've never moved forward. Some of them have gotten many extensions, so that you may have school capacity being held up for a sort of project that isn't on the ground. Yeah. And that's one of the sort of issues with the whole moratorium process, is that it is not very practical real life. It's really more of a formula. And, I think that one of the things we're trying to achieve through this update to the growth policy is trying to make it more connected with reality, not just totally formulaic.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can you, Jason, say what's the question in front of us right now?
Sure.
With all the talk, it's
right.
just...
Well, so the question that's before you right now is this particular, and I'm just getting back to it. I didn't realize it was going to make me have to do a million. Here we go. Okay. Is this potential new recommendation to add to the policy that you send to the council, and that would be to establish this new exception? And if you did provide this new exception, what would be the appropriate network distance, and if you wanted us to come back to you with other maps that had different distances, we could when we come back to you guys on this, as well as different, what would be the appropriate threshold here. I did want to just point out, though, just real quickly in response to the chair's comments, that if the point is to eliminate moratorium, then maybe we should just not have moratorium anywhere, because that's essentially what this does. It's kind of playing a game with saying, well, we have a moratorium in the greenfield impact area, but we're pretty much going to allow an exception to it all the time. And so maybe the right solution then is to just not have moratorium anywhere. But as we pointed out numerous times, we still feel, staff feels pretty strongly that the moratorium tool is still an appropriate tool in this area of the county. We did the whole analysis in creating these school impact areas based on the growth context, which looked at the amount of growth that the area is experiencing, the type of growth, the type of the form of the dwelling units, and then in their impact on enrollment. And this is an area where that new development is still impacting schools, and so the idea of a moratorium is still an effective tool, whereas it is not an effective tool in the turnover and fill area. It just doesn't work there, and there's no reason to have it there. Here's an area where it still makes sense. So,
okay, but you know what? Here's the problem. The staff it was the staff that brought this issue to the board's attention, that these two projects in Clarksburg were about to be hit with a moratorium. I didn't bring it up, and apparently that was in response to some discussions that staff was having during development review with the developers in question. But my understanding, it's very clear the staff thought that was a problem.
Well, I'd like to just frame this not about two specific development applications, but really as a policy issue. Mm-hmm. Clarksburg is an important housing resource for Montgomery County. It provides a type of housing that we do not have a great deal of in many parts of the county. It provides affordable single-family detached and single-family attached houses for families. And that is an important housing resource. From a policy standpoint, we are concerned about the idea, again, because of, again, decisions that MCPS made for, I'm sure, very good educational reasons to create the one area in the county that will be a moratorium area, the Greenfields area, and essentially put it immediately into moratorium. And even though we know and acknowledge that this is a really important housing resource area for the county. So I think what staff is saying is we have heard from the board and we've explored an idea that was raised as a solution, which was this idea to be able to borrow from nearby clusters. And we explored another solution, which Jason outlined, which is because, frankly, we are putting a lot of additional burdens on our greenfields areas, not only in terms of moratorium, but in terms of the impact tax rates and a variety of other things. We're making it a tough area to develop in. And one solution that, again, Jason went through that isn't the borrowing would be to raise the cap to 125%. Not because we're trying to help any particular developer, but in recognition from a policy standpoint that we are creating additional hurdles, frankly, in this part of the county, which is an important housing resource area for us. It provides a kind of housing that we aren't getting anywhere else, and that perhaps in recognition of those additional hurdles, we might increase the cap to 125 with the 3-year period that Jason described. So, again, I want to be very clear because I think the messaging on this has been very confused. We are not out here trying to help to development projects. We are trying to look at this from a policy perspective of saying, here is housing being developed of a type we're not getting anywhere else in the county. This growth policy is adding a significant number of hurdles, probably appropriately so, but it is adding a significant number of hurdles to putting that housing in place that we know we need.
Well,
can we do something to offer a small, I don't want to call it incentive, a small benefit to balance the hurdles that we have been putting in place?
Well, I thought that's what I was doing when I suggested this idea of adjacent clusters. You know, when you had raised this issue that there are these two projects, I proposed what has been called borrowing. I don't think it's borrowing, it's just recognizing that there is actually nearby capacity available. That's a reality to recognize whatever the boundary situation is, there is school classroom capacity available. I thought that was a principled way to address not two projects, but to address the general problem, which is created not just for those two projects, but prospectively in Clarksburg, at least. And the benefit of my proposal is that it actually puts pressure on MCPS to solve the problem instead of just saying, well, let's punt and allow the school to get more crowded. I mean, my solution would create structural incentives for MCPS, either to assign a new subdivision to an adjoining cluster or allow more change of school assignment requests, or to change a boundary, or to do any number of other things that are outlined in that OLO report. If we just change the threshold, we're basically saying, let's just, that's unpopular, so let's just allow the schools to go to 125%, which doesn't solve any problem for anyone. It just makes the school more crowded.
Well, but this is Jason, and I would just say that I think what we found, though, as we explored that potential solution of allowing borrowing, is that it's not as simple as it seems. That it complicates things because we need to actually answer how far and what is how adequate does the other school have to be, and so we have to make those decisions. And I'm not so sure it forces MCPS to make a particular decision, whereas the idea of raising the threshold, what we're saying there is that as a planning board for the things that we have the control over, we're fine with saying adequacy can be higher. Like our adequacy standard can be higher in this area because we recognize that it provides a needed affordable housing in the form of single family for the county. But if it gets to 125%, that's where we're going to say, okay, that's our emergency shutoff, right? So it still provides a little bit of teeth to a policy that says you have to have adequate infrastructure, but it still also allows, a little bit more room for the development that we'd like to see happen.
Jason, this is Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. Two things. Casey, first question, is what we have right now in front of us in the PowerPoint, is that your proposal? Is that what you're saying?
No, my proposal would be, well, I would modify what's in front of us in the PowerPoint. I would say that it should be 3 network miles for elementary school, 5 network miles for middle school, 10 network miles for high school. And if you like, I would even say you could take it down to 105%. As we saw from the map, there's at least 3 high schools that are in range of Clarksburg at the high school level that are not really even close to 100. Watkins Mill, Damascus, Poolsville maybe doesn't work because it's too far away. Northwest maybe is a little high, but at least Damascus and Poolsville, and if you could, even add 5% to Seneca Valley, you would be, among those 3 high schools, if you made the test 105%, I think you would comfortably be able to accommodate Clarksburg in a reasonable way.
Well, can I just say, I'm going to give you my personal example with my own children. As you know, my kids go to Tacoma Park Elementary School, and I live in Wheaton. That's almost 7 miles from my house. And the reason why they go there is because my husband and I chose for them to go there. They are in the magnet program. It's a decision that we made. And it takes them, with the bus, the school bus, the magnet school bus, it takes an hour for 7 miles, okay? An hour each way. So when you say 10 miles for high school, then again, I use myself as an example. When I was in high school, I work. I had to work to help my mom after school. And then telling me that, so I put myself in a situation where I didn't have a car, getting off the school, going to work, and then getting back home 10 miles away. That's rough. And so, and besides all that, it's not a decision that I can make. I think the most, and I get your point. I understand. Honestly, I do. But I see the growth happening in Up County and the needs happening in Up County. And I do believe that what Jason and Gwen, the staff is proposing is more reasonable. At the end of the day, this is just a recommendation that the county council is going to evaluate after hearing from the school board, I'm assuming, MCPSS. And so I honestly just think it's better to just leave it as the staff has presented it. That's just my take.
So you're saying 125%?
Yes, I am.
Okay. With a 3-year window?
3-year, yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. So we have the staff's proposal. We have the initial staff proposal as modified by Casey. What do Parthop and Jerry think?
Well, I guess let me frame it this way. I originally thought, for instance, the Seneca High School, I don't know whether they run a bus out to Boyd's to pick up. And I just thought to accommodate these projects in Clarksburg, again, the fact that these are single-family, affordable homes that fit that Greenfield area, that, and the project's not coming online for 2 years, that they could conceivably run a bus from Great Seneca to Boyd's and pick up students. I think I would go with the 125% as an option. The other thing I proposed was kind of given the COVID uncertainty that these two projects in Clarksburg were supposed to be approved by the 1st of July. If they had been, maybe there's a kind of a COVID period where they could still be approved under the kind of the FY20 as opposed to falling in FY21. So I see kind of maybe 3 options, but giving the flexibility at a high school level, 10 miles seems reasonable, 125%, that if that's the chart that we're looking at, seems reasonable.
And,
so are you for the staff's proposal, my proposal, or both? I don't quite.
Well, I think you were. It was the staff's. If I put it back on the board, but the way they laid it out, then you said at least on the high school go 125. I thought. Were you saying all 3?
My argument was not 125%. It was modify the first staff proposal, which was this so-called borrowing idea, by imposing a limitation on the distance to 3, 5, and 10 miles, and make the threshold 105% for considering whether that capacity is actually should be considered as available for the adjacent school. Right. So it's just a different approach.
You said 105. I thought you said 125.
No, 105 for purposes of deciding whether that school has available capacity that could be used for an overcrowded school next to it. It's just a different thing.
I'm going to see if I can update that slide while we're talking through this so that it can be clear what you're looking at.
So, Casey, are you proposing to increase the miles distance as well?
I'm saying for elementary and middle school, it should decrease the miles. It shouldn't be 10 miles. For high schools, 10 miles. For middle schools, 5 miles. For elementary school, 3 miles. Because there are more of them, they tend to be closer by. You don't want a situation where you're taking capacity from 8 elementary schools away, and it's less reasonable to expect parents to be having to shuttle their little kids all over the place. And the threshold of 105% to decide whether or not that school has available room that could be available for use by the crowded school.
So you would actually decrease the threshold quite a bit.
Yeah.
I like the split of the miles, the 3, 5, and 10. Why don't we give what the staff has recommended, the kind of keep it at 110, don't lower it to 105. Not going to 125, let's leave it at 110, 10%, and go with that. Go with the 3, 5, and the 10 miles.
I think it's best to wait for Jason to place on the screen what's being proposed, because, I mean, everybody's throwing numbers like crazy. In 10 miles, it's a lot for a high school, but hey.
And this is Essie. Can I make one clarifying statement? I would just like to clarify that when we talk about making a boundary change, so again, as I've said, it's certainly my view, and I think the Board of Education's view, that we are using boundary changes more frequently, and we have more frequently. However, I think it would be very challenging for the board to recommend a boundary study to add students to a school that's already over capacity. I think that premise would be very challenging for the board to adopt. When we look at boundary studies, we really are looking more where there is available capacity. And again, we can discuss how that's applied, but I can say that it would be very, very challenging for the board to add students to a school that is over 100% capacity. It's even a little challenging to think about it at like that 95 or 98, because again, it's not what our policy envisions. But even if we were to go to that direction of moving small groups in different configurations, adding them to a building already over capacity, I think would be a very challenging proposition for the Board of Education.
So, Essie, your proposal is to say that the utilization should be like 95%.
I think at the maximum, yes.
All right, let's hear from Parthop. Well, Jason is, I think, adjusting this.
It should be up on your screen now, is it not?
Yes, it is 105.
Okay, yeah.
So, Jason, can you explain what you updated?
Sure. So the way this probably should say or here, but basically now we're saying that if the school with available space is located within 3, 5, or 10 network miles for elementary, middle, or high school respectively, and what is adequate is 105%. And I also modified the seat deficit. See, this is where it gets complicated to elementary, middle school level. 105% at a school that's small is really not that great. But to Essie's point, even at 105%, they would never consider this, right? So, the question is, should this be even lower? Should it actually be at 95%? And there, I think we're adding some things that kind of still give a little bit of teeth to the idea that there could be a moratorium, right? Like, we're only going to allow you an exception to this if there's a school that's nearby that has excess capacity, not a school that is already overcrowded. Right? At 105%, it's already overcrowded.
And I think this is a very important point, which is, as I said earlier, we're trying to tie the growth policy to reality. We've just been told by Essie that we could approve whatever we want to approve, but MCPS is not going to do a boundary change or move kids into a school that's already at 105%. And so if this is going to work, I think that the schools do need to be something that where it's really possible that MCPS will move kids. And I think 95% is what I hear Essie saying. Is that correct? I don't want to put words in your mouth, Essie.
No, I appreciate that. And so I think 95 would be the maximum amount. And again, I certainly can't commit the Board of Education to a certain action, as I know everyone appreciates, but certainly I think that would be more in the realm of something that could be considered. Again, typically we prefer to add to leave some flexibility, but we understand that, again, situations are difficult, and I think that would be at least approaching the direction that we could consider.
And there are a couple of schools, if we look at the map, there are some schools that are around the 95% threshold already that we were looking at, or less. What I'm going to propose is maybe we send both options to the county council for review, and they can make a decision, if everyone's okay with that.
The reason why I'm not okay with that, and you guys, if you're not speaking, you gotta turn off your delay.
Natalie, we're getting a lot of feedback. I think everybody else needs to mute, please, so we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, I just said that. Yeah, I think I'm fine. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Casey. Guys, the good thing is that we all want to make this work. Everybody agrees on that. You know, that's something that we all need to hug each other, not now, after the pandemic. But as he's saying, if the school is not going to approve this, it's not going to pass the council, I honestly think Jason came up with the best solution. I don't know why we opening cans of worms here. So I'm assuming I'm not the only one agreeing with Jason here. I mean, after you heard Essie saying what she had to say and the explanations and the data.
I'm really baffled why it is that everybody seems to be throwing up their hands when MCPS says, well, we're not going to do that. If MCPS won't fix a problem that's under their control, I don't understand why that's a reason for us to say, oh, okay, well, never mind. I mean, if you agree that there's capacity at some of these schools and MCPS won't use it, then I think everybody who doesn't like this proposal should go to complain to MCPS, not to the planning department or the planning board. I mean, why is that our responsibility to fix, and why is that as a reason to adopt a policy because MCPS won't use school buildings that are actually in existence? I just don't understand that.
Clarify, what I said was that we would probably not.
Essie, I've been very generous, I think, about letting you talk. I really have to ask you to draw it to a close. You have anything you really need to say, that's fine. But really, I'd ask you to limit it to if there's something that has not already been said.
Jerry again. I think we've reached agreement on the 3, 5, and 10. The issue is maybe 95 to 105. Can we go with the 95? It may have the best chance going through the council and the school board say, yeah, we can work with that.
No, we did not reach agreement. Only maybe, no, because I'm saying that's crazy. I'm saying we should leave it as the staff recommended. Jason, can you go back to the other slide, the one that you're suggesting?
Which are we talking about, the 125%?
Yeah, what's on the report, what you're suggesting?
Right, so I mean, it's this one here that is just talking about if you raise the threshold to 125% and went with the 3-year, you would allow more development to still go forward. You don't have to play games with an exception that is looking at what is the appropriate distance, what is the appropriate amount of space that's available at the other school. You're just simply saying we're going to increase the threshold that will allow more to get approved, but at a certain point we're going to have to actually stop it, and that's at 125%.
Well, I just have to take exception to your calling this playing games because the capacity exists. There's no game. It's not a fiction. There is a school building with seats. There's no debate about that.
Not if it's at 110%, though, right? That's where we need to. If we're saying 110% or 105%,
schools in the school system routinely operate with 110% students. In fact, almost every part of the county has school buildings that are over what's theoretically 100% of capacity. So clearly, they are accommodating students in these buildings with numbers in excess of 100% of what their theoretical capacity is. All right, could we please hear from Parthop and Jerry?
Jerry, in terms of this chart, can you turn that into language? Take that language. No?
Yeah. Well, this is, I don't have any text to this, but it's just simply showing that if we went from, this is really kind of give you a sense of how reliable are the projections at different levels, that if we went to 3 years and 125%, we're kind of dealing with the same as what we are today in terms of, it could be as high as 130, 131, 132%. We're saying that we'd be fine with doing that at the 3-year, raising that threshold.
And the blue chart that's showing there, that it's
This is where we are today.
Which
right?
is what percent?
This is 120% here. The real range of it, what we have historically seen, and some things fall beyond this, some things fall within it, is that typically, on average, the projections are off by about 10% or so, and so you end up with, well, the projection might say 120%. In reality, it could be as low as 110 or as high as 130 when we get to that.
And this is a change from the 5-year to the 3.
Right. This is, if we go to 3 years, you're dealing with a smaller margin of error, which is why we particularly feel comfortable going with the higher threshold of 125%.
Okay. Gwen, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
I mean, on this that recommendation.
I thought actually what Commissioner Verma was saying is earlier, and maybe he'd like to go back to it, as an interesting option. These are both viable solutions. Again, and I want to frame this as a policy discussion, not about two projects, but how do we maintain the ability to still build affordable single-family attached and detached houses in the northern part of Montgomery County for a while still being very cognizant of the need for schools and public facilities. And I think these are two different, but each approach has merit. And I think what Commissioner Verma had been starting to say, but I'll let him speak for himself, was could we send a growth policy up that essentially outlines the policy goal of, yes, trying to make it, very strict in the greenfields areas for all the reasons we've talked about, but also not wanting to immediately throw an area that's providing a very important housing resource for the county into immediate moratorium, and offer these two options as options for the council to consider. I think that's where Commissioner Verma was going.
That's correct. I think that's something that's viable, and it gives us two options that the council could look at, and I couldn't have said it better. So you're absolutely right, Director Wright. That's my position, and maybe we can agree on that. What does everyone think?
I second that, Portaf, so we can move on.
I'm with you. That's 3.
This is Jason. Yep, we could actually present this as 2 separate recommendations that are in there, and they can pick and choose and to adopt either one or both or neither, right? That's right, but we could put them both in as recommendations.
Jerry, are you going to make this unanimous?
We can't hear you, Jerry. You're muted.
Yes, I would. Yes.
Okay,
make it unanimous.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Good
If I
Thank you, Gwen.
could, though, because it'll help us prepare what we send along, are we looking at this one, this was originally at 110%, or are we looking at, so are we looking at 105% to send along as the recommendation, or 95%?
95, right?
Well, I think we should, my proposal is 105, and the council can put in whatever number they want. I mean, I didn't want to get into this debate, which is why I had to cut SE off, because we can't just have this debate going on all afternoon. But I think the point is that OLO report identifies a bunch of things other than boundary changes that MCPS can do to manage capacity at the margin. And the one that's obvious to deal with these sort of marginal cases with a few students is COSAs. You could allow people to transfer schools who want to transfer without doing any boundary changes, without doing any programmatic changes, without building anything. And it seems to me like, yeah, I get it that the school board's not going to want to do a boundary change to add capacity for a school that's already at 100%, but they could certainly allow some kids to transfer who want to raise their hand and say, hey, I'd rather go to the school over there than the one over here, which is kind of like your situation, Natalie. You have made a choice because of a program in Tacoma Park that you're willing to suck it up and deal with that commute. Some kids, for whatever reason, maybe it's an athletic program, maybe it's they have friends who live on the other side of town, whatever it is, are going to want to go to a different school. And I think that we should be encouraging MCPS to explore those kind of options in addition to boundary changes and in addition to capital program approaches that would allow this to be sort of smoothed out in a way that allows everybody to build housing and still have places for kids to go to school. So that's why I think 105 is a good number. And also, you know, the council obviously can pick 95, 100, they could pick any number they want.
All right, Jerry says, yeah, I'll go 105. My children were in portables, and my grandchildren are in portables, so let's go to 105 then. We can get 4 votes that way.
That's fine. Let's move on.
Okay.
Patap?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, 105.
Okay, so the next thing we had was recommendation 4.10, which was to eliminate the moratorium exception that was adopted in 2019 pertaining to projects providing high quantities of deeply affordable housing or projects removing condemned buildings. So this was in many ways was kind of a temporary solution in the hopes that the update to the subdivision staging policy would address moratoria in our denser, more urban areas where we have, you know, condemned buildings that we would like to the community would like to remove, and if when we have moratorium, that was prevented previously. And so we didn't see this as necessarily promoting, you know, affordable housing or, you know, revitalization of neighbors. It was really something that was targeted towards a couple of projects that could not go forward last year. And so our recommendation is to remove this, especially because we've eliminated moratoria in most of the places where these types of projects would happen. This is basically what I've just said, though. So some comments that we've received on this. We're all against this recommendation with the idea to keep that exception. NAIOP suggested that if any portion of the county would still be subject to an automatic moratoria, then we should still have this exception. And MBIA also said that we should maintain the exemptions for affordable housing. ULI expressed concern that this might not, essentially, the perception of this, that it looks like we're deprioritizing affordable housing production. But again, I kind of point back to that this was really a stopgap to allow a couple of projects down county to go forward, and that we didn't see it necessary given that we've eliminated moratoria in those infill areas. And also when we did the analysis for council staff on that bill that changed the resolution that added this exception, we could not find any other potential projects that would fit the exception as it was written. And I believe that's still the case today.
Hearing no objection, I think the board is supporting the staff's recommendation here.
Okay. All right, so now student generation rates. Recommendation 4.11 suggests that we calculate countywide and school impact area student generation rates by analyzing all single-family units built in all years and multifamily units built since 1990, without distinguishing multifamily buildings by height. So we're going to break this out into 2 or 3 different components here. So first, multifamily units built in the last several decades generate students very differently from older multifamily units. And we believe it's not based on the fact that there's a particular year associated with it, but the fact that they tend to have fewer bedrooms, they tend to be smaller units, they tend to be more expensive. Just in general, they're less family oriented. And that kind of it demonstrates itself in this graph here that we've shown you previously, but it shows you the student generation rate by decade built for multifamily. And what we did do was we took a look at, now we didn't choose, there had been some confusion. The thought was, someone asked, well, I guess in 4 years, do we increase it to 1994? No, the thought was, we're not saying those built in the last 30 years. We're saying those built since 1990, that's the cutoff. And in 4 years, if we continue with this, we would still use 1990 as the cutoff unless we saw that things were behaving differently. But we think that 1990 is where we see a material difference in how these are generating students. And we did a statistical analysis on this, and we found that the 1990s were very different from the 80s, and the 80s were also very different from the 90s through, so we considered should we add the 80s in, but the 80s did not, those built in the 80s were not consistent or similar to those built after 1990. When we talk about the size of the units, the number in rental units, I believe we had this with our housing needs assessment. You may have seen this already. But, you know, those built since 1990 you're seeing more and more studio and one-bedroom apartments. In fact, over this past decade, the majority of multifamily units that were built were either studio or one-bedroom units. Very few three-bedroom units. Now, why do we recommend eliminating the distinction between high-rise and low-rise? There are a number of things at play here. First, our recent analysis suggests that the distinction between low-rise and high-rise might be more of a distinction between old buildings and new buildings. Now, I'm going to show you some numbers that show that that's not fully consistent. However, the two are kind of merging together in these later decades. Also, it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to be able to do the analysis at where we distinguish between low-rise and high-rise. The land use designations in the State Department of Assessments and Taxation parcel data that we use to calculate those student generation rates are inconsistent and unreliable for multifamily uses. And so we, every time we update these student generation rates, we have to go through an extensive process of doing quality control and corrections to the data. And then we've also recently been told by SDAT that they are no longer going to maintain the land use field in that data. And so it just further complicates it for us. But the value in there now is based on some land assessor's determination of whether something's high-rise or low-rise. Doesn't necessarily correspond to how we measure it. And so we need to always go through and fix those. Also, the low-rise and high-rise distinction originally was based on the construction type. Low-rise, which we define as 4 stories or less, was consistently built with lumber. And high-rise, you couldn't generally use for 5 stories or more, you couldn't use lumber, which is more affordable to the developer, which has implications in the types of units that they build and so on. And now what we're finding is that really 6, 7 stories or sometimes even more could be built with lumber, kind of changing the interplay between the number of stories and all of this. And so for that reason, we also recommend just removing this distinction. And then also just this general, even when we go through it and reclassify things ourselves, it's always, we've got this, it's unclear when it's one building, but on one side it's 3 stories, on another side it's 6 stories. How do we count that? We can't split it out. We don't know how many units are on each side, and so we just have to pick one. This, again, would just eliminate the need to have to deal with that. Now, we did receive some questions about, well, did we calculate the difference between high-rise and low-rise in terms of student generation for those units built since 1990? We did not, because our recommendations were to use the 1990 on and to eliminate the distinction, and so that's what we've calculated. We did, however, we had done an earlier analysis using 2018 enrollment data, and the distinction here, when we looked at it by decades, the decade started in 1991 as opposed to 1990. And so this is slightly different from what we're suggesting, which is the cutoff at 1990, but it gives you a sense of what's going on here, and I'll explain what you're looking at. These are student generation rates for multifamily low-rise and multifamily high-rise built through 1990 and built after 1991 or 1991 and later. And so there are a couple of things that we point out here. Even in the multifamily units post-1990, these 1991 and later, you could see that those low-rise are still generating 3 to 4 times as many students as the multifamily high-rise. Okay, but the low-rise rate falls more. You could see from 1990 through 1991, this fell by more than half, whereas the high-rise also fell by more than half, but not nearly as many students, actual students. And so as a result, when you look at the difference between low-rise and high-rise before 1990, the difference for, if you look at this as 100 units, the difference between low-rise and high-rise is 32 students. Whereas now, in those built since 1991, the difference is just under 15 students. So in a way, these units are kind of merging in terms of the distinction between high-rise and low-rise and the number of students that they generate. Okay, and then for single family, why do we want to continue to use all years built? Well, here, the relationship between year built and student generation is less clear, with no real distinction based on the decade that it was built, that the student generation rate tends to be more cyclical based on how recently the unit was sold. So very likely that a single family unit generates students between 10 and 15 years. After 15 years, on average, they really generate very few students, if any at all. If we somehow limited this to only look at units built in the last 10 years or 15 years, we would be biasing the rates in favor of those that have students. And so we recommend looking at it over the entire lifespan of the home. And there are a couple of other things that I can show you on this. First, this gives you a sense of how frequently homes turn over. 61% of owners have lived in their home, their single-family home, more than 10 years, compared to only 13%. I show you here. So only 13% have lived in their apartments for more than 10 years, 1, 2, and 10, right? 38% of renters have lived in their home only for 2 years or less. So there's more turnover in those multifamily than you have in single family. And just to demonstrate the way this works, if you imagine an individual unit, the blue being a single family unit, assuming it gets sold today or is built today in this year, might be generating a student for the next 3 years, and then maybe in 2 years, and in 3 years they're generating 2, and maybe they have a third student. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be consistent for every single individual unit. Some will never have students. Some are sold after just a couple of years. Some might have 5 or 6 students. But this is just kind of the typical pattern, right, that you see. For the first few years, there's going to be generating students, and then for a long period of time, they're not generating anything. Whereas a multifamily unit might go a number of years before it even generates a single student. And then it might only generate it for 1 year because the people don't stay in the home in those units for very long. Again, this is not always the case. Some people stay in their multifamily rental unit for decades, and some have more than 1 student. But the idea is this is generally what we see on average, where occasionally there's a student, and it's more consistent for that unit over time, whereas the single family really comes in waves. And so we wouldn't want to do anything that focuses the single family just on built in the last 10 years, because you're going to get all of this, and you're never going to get that period of time where they're not generating students. So all of that said, here are the student generation rates that we use currently. Currently, we use county-wide rates to calculate the impact taxes, but then we use regional rates to calculate the impact of a development application. We also use these regional rates to calculate the impact of a master plan. But these regional rates are based on cluster boundaries, school cluster boundaries, and so that are near each other. They're geographically close to each other, but they're not necessarily consistent in terms of the type of development that they're experiencing and their impact on or what the housing stock looks like, and that housing stock and the new development's impact on students. And so with what we've proposed in looking at it, again, countywide, but also by the school impact areas, where we've said there are, similar characteristics now. Those infill areas aren't all in one geography. They're throughout the county, but they all have a consistent land use and that land use impact on schools. And so we like the idea of using the infill impact area, the school impact area student generation rates. Now, here's where something else that you guys talked about two weeks ago comes into play. You talked about adding all of the, I'm gonna choose my words carefully here. Talked about adding all the metro station policy areas, and there's a reason why I'm saying that. Our red policy areas today as infill impact areas. These are areas where we want to see a lot of new development that's along the lines of infill type of development going. And so option A here is based on what was in the public hearing draft. Option B is where we've added the metro station policy areas to our infill impact areas. We did that. We reassigned students today, from what had been turnover impact area. Now they were located in infill because we've changed the designation of where they live. And we recalculated the student generation rates. Now it's tough to just look at these numbers and get a sense of what the impact was. So I've on this next slide, I just show you what the change did. Obviously, countywide, nothing changed. Also, nothing changed in the Greenfield impact area because none of our metro station policy areas are located in there. However, we did, what you see is that the single-family attached and detached rates for infill went up slightly. And actually, I'd say, went up a little bit, but the multifamily went up as well, but very slightly. The turnover impact area saw a slight decrease in the single-family rates, and the multifamily also, just like the infill areas, increased slightly. So, excuse me. The reason I'm showing you all of this is because this has implications all the way down through, right? So we use these student generation rates then to calculate the impact taxes and to calculate the utilization premium payments. And so we don't need you necessarily to make a decision today on all of this, but we did want to let you know that we do have folks at Department of Finance are running the fiscal impact using option B, which is the one that has put the metro station policy areas into the infill areas. The question I have for you today is, what do you want to do with the purple line station areas? I know when we've talked about this on the transportation side, we've said that we want to put all of the purple line station areas into the red policy area. The point there being that those areas are defined based on their transportation components. Do we necessarily want to make that same assumption on the school side, where what we're talking about is the type of development and the impact that that has on schools? And the point that I'll bring up, this is something that was just posted today in preparation for next week's conversation on transportation. Here are the Dale Drive and Manchester Place proposed boundaries. And I'm not going to get into the details of these boundary options right now. We'll talk about that next week. But I just want to point out what you're dealing with here for Dale Drive and Manchester Place are heavily residential neighborhoods. And so the question is this really consistent with our concept of infill, and whether or not you want to then include the purple line areas in our infill areas? And if you did, what we do is create an option C. We'll run the student generation rates again, and we'll give that to OMB and Department of Finance to hopefully have two different scenarios that they can show you next week. I will just say some comments on this. First, ULI enthusiastically, I should say the ULI panel enthusiastically endorsed this idea of splitting, of using only 1990 on and also combining them all. NAOP also supported this recommendation. MCPTA supported calculating the student generation rate since 1990 as proposed, but want us to continue to track the 4 different types if we can, to the best of our ability so that we can know whether it was a good decision in the future. There's some questions about whether we could conduct our student generation rate calculations eliminating vacant units. I think Ms. Gavoni might be able to address that a little bit. I think that would be fairly difficult because we don't necessarily know in a multifamily building which units are generating the students, which ones are vacant, which ones are so on. Obviously, a vacant one isn't generating students, and whether or not short-term rentals can be excluded from the unit count as well. These last 2 points are, I would say we have not actually tested the statistical significance between high-rise and low-rise, though we think the difference is more connected to the age of the structure and a material change in the number of bedrooms and size and so on. This last point, we do not believe that we should limit the multifamily student generation rates to the last decade. So there was a suggestion that we should look only from 2010 on. We did not look at the statistical significance between 2010 and 1990 and on. However, it's understandable that the 2010 decade has lower student generation rates because many of those units that were built in this last decade still have a lot of vacancies. Some of them came on at the very end of the decade. So they just haven't fully been occupied yet. So we wouldn't want to look at just built in the last 10 years for that. We like the cutoff of 1990. So that's all I have to say on all of this, and I'm happy to go back to any slide that you'd like me to.
So I think that, though, in addition to the things that the staff has presented, meaning the staff's recommendations, which I don't think anybody will have any issue with, but anybody who does can feel free to say so. I think the other thing that we need to specifically address is the infill impact application to the purple line areas. So if we could get input from the board on that, that would be good. Anyone who
on the purple line, you had dark red, and then you have red. I thought we were talking about Littonsville, Connecticut Avenue. I mean, obviously Bethesda, Silver Spring, Connecticut Avenue, not necessarily Dale Drive, and then the others to the east.
Yeah, so it was pretty clear at the end of last week that I know that you had expressed concern over including Dale Drive and Manchester Place, but it seemed that the board came down on the side of including all of the purple line station areas as red.
Yeah, the old Blair there, and whether that was susceptible to redevelopment. But right. I know you've extended the option D on the Silver Spring. I don't think that quite came down to Dale Drive. So that, if you had done that D, additional infill development, that might have raised it. But if all of them are in, that's fine too. All in the red. Yeah, fine.
Right. So the question before you with respect to schools is if now all of those purple line station areas, as you define, and so we couldn't calculate the student generation rates for you today because we don't yet know where you're going to decide those boundaries are going to be. But once we know what those boundaries are, and we can run the estimate, the counts on those. The question is, should all of the purple line station areas be included as infill? Should none of them be? Should we only count the metro station policy areas, which is our current option B? Or I guess a fourth option would be if you wanted to have just those that had been identified as dark red previously.
This is
well, go ahead, Matap.
I think we should treat it just like we treat all other red line stations. I think that's the direction the board was given last week to the planning department. Natalie, do you have an opinion on that?
No, I thought we covered this last week.
Yeah, I thought we did too. I was thinking maybe not Dale Drive, but that's fine. All of them would be good.
I would just point that it's a distinction, though. Last week we were talking about transportation and how those neighborhoods, act in terms of the transportation access could be consistent. But it may not necessarily reflect on the way we've defined infill, right? And so we can make that change. Just keep in mind that when we go to we calculate those student generation rates, by adding in, those infill numbers are going to increase. The student generation rates are going to increase because we're going to be adding in an entire single-family neighborhood that is probably going to generate a lot of students. Whereas
That's good. That's not good.
Whereas
right there.
Right. By the way we've defined it now, this is it's more of the compact development, the largely multifamily that doesn't generate a lot of students. And by adding in these neighborhoods with more single-family neighborhoods, you're going to change.
Jason, so the ones in question will be the ones with a lot of single families are Dale Drive and what else was it?
Dale Drive, Manchester Place. Manchester Place has some multifamily, but then you also have Woodside. I don't have that map, but it should be posted in the staff report for next week.
And you're recommending not having those included. Is that?
I think it makes a lot. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to include the metro station policy areas, right? Which will capture, Silver Spring, Bethesda, and even the Silver Spring Library stop is captured in that too.
I'm skeptical that including the single-family neighborhoods is going to change that number very dramatically, because the number of units developed as infill in places like Woodside is very small. I mean, I live in Woodside, and I can tell you the number of units added in the last 20 years since I've been there. I think I can count on both hands. No, that's not true. There was a townhouse project, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. It's a small number is the point. Whereas, the number of units that are going to be used in the calculation for student generation is largely going to be those other infill impact areas, which are, as you described, large multifamily projects. So I'm not sure I follow you on this argument that that's going to bring that generation rate number up dramatically.
Well,
maybe. I mean, that's a math problem, right? There's an objectively right answer to that, but I'm just saying I'm not. If you want to do the math and come back to us with that and see how it changes, fine. But I don't.
So what we'll assume, we can do that, and now because we just finalized like this today, we will work off of what we're recommending, and obviously if you tweak them next week, we'll ultimately make the appropriate adjustments, but we will run that student generation rate analysis now using what we're recommending for Dale Drive and Manchester Place, as well as Littonsville and 16th Street Woodside. Adding those in along with the ones that we've already previously identified as dark red. And that will be another scenario that we can take a look at, and we'll try to get that calculated and off to OMB so that they can run the fiscal impact of that scenario as well.
Right. The other point about this is it would only affect the generation rate for a single family, not the lower generation rate for a multifamily. And I don't see, even if it did bump it up a little bit, I think the principal thing to do is to account for that in whatever let the chips fall there where they may as far as what that does to rates. But I just don't see that the impact on the generation rate is a reason not to do this, even if you're correct and it changes as a result of including these purple line areas, because it would only affect the single family number.
This is Lisa. I could chime in very quickly. Is one of the things we could also do is when we come back, we can pull out the neighborhoods to see which ones behave more like infill neighborhoods. So if the chair's assumptions are correct, we could see how Woodside student generation rates compare to the overall number, just because these areas were created based on a numbers game where we looked at housing growth and population growth and enrollment growth. So we could do something similar and come back to the board in 2 weeks with options.
I think that would be very helpful. Let's do that.
I recall when we did option D in Silver Spring, we went north of Spring Street, but only in one property, just those that bordered Spring Street. We didn't go further north.
Right. That was for the identification of the master plan area. Right.
Yeah.
So I just did want to show you that we've updated our web map to show this was, here's what we had in the working draft in terms of the designation of the infill areas. When we add in right now the red policy, the metro station policy areas, you could see how, we've added in Forest Glen, we've added in Glenmont, we added a little bit more around all of these in here, around there, and here. And so now what we'll do is we'll have another scenario which we'll add to this, which will add in basically a strip right across here for the purple lines. Okay. All right. So that we'll work down in that direction then. All right. I'm going to get on to recommendation 412. We're now talking about development application review. And our first recommendation here is that, and this is one that we've received a good amount of comments on, and you heard some earlier today, the county growth policy should explicitly allow the planning board to deny a residential development application in turnover impact areas and infill impact areas if it deems there is inadequate public school infrastructure after consideration of the applicable data and circumstances. So the idea here is that when we have in areas where we've said there's no automatic moratorium, we've taken to using the term automatic because the policy doesn't require that you deny an application in those areas. It's no longer automatic. But that the board still has a responsibility to make an adequate public facilities finding. And that finding, you could say, well, just because there's no moratorium, we have found that there's nothing that could be inadequate here. But rather than say that, we think it makes sense for the planning board with each development application to affirmatively say, yes, there is adequate public facilities in this case. And in particular, those that meet the 120% threshold where there would have been a moratorium, right, that now in those areas we're going to require an explicit, finding by the planning board that, yes, there's adequate facilities. And to help you with that, we would provide you with this information for each of those applications. Facility status information, including the number of relocatable classrooms and the key facility indicator information. This is the data that I showed you previously that for each school, MCPS has kind of done an analysis of the facility, different aspects of the facilities in terms of their maintenance or their functioning. And part of even providing this information is that it can be part of an ongoing dialogue between the developer and MCPS for potential solutions or improvements that the developer could contribute towards. We would also provide the development applications and estimated enrollment impacts. So we would tell you, here's how many students we estimate this project will generate. You'd get the historical, current, and projected school utilization data for the schools that serve the property, as well as information on the 3 nearest schools at each level. So you could see whether or not there's capacity at a nearby school. And then finally, we would give you some updated development pipeline status for areas for projects serving served by the same schools. So you get a sense of, oh, okay, well, are we talking about a project that might generate a few students in an area where maybe this school's overcrowded, but the neighboring schools are fine, and there's nothing else in the pipeline. That would be different from a project that is going to generate a lot of students, all the schools nearby are full, and the development pipeline is pretty full too, right? You might have a different finding. Some of the concerns we have that people have expressed over this is that it could lead to some subjective determination and arbitrary results by the board. And I have to tell you that concern was expressed by people on all spectrums, right? So developers, MCCPTA, the parent community, they all kind of felt that they don't like the idea of giving the board that discretionary review. There was a suggestion by MCCPTA that what it should be, and I believe you heard Ms. Calhoun talked about this, that there should be a consistent rubric, something that the board looks at and says, okay, well, here's how we're going to evaluate this, so that it's not completely arbitrary or doesn't feel arbitrary to the developers or the community in how the board makes their decisions on this. So that is it on this.
Any thoughts on this from board members? If there aren't, we will assume that the staff's recommendations will be have met with the approval of the board. I don't, and I'm sorry, did somebody have something to say? I was just going to say I'm not really entirely comfortable with the idea of eliminating the moratorium, but then saying the board can go ahead and deny an application based on some, sort of multi-part balancing test that's not really very clear as to when it kicks in. I don't necessarily object in principle to the idea of like some kind of fail-safe mechanism, but this seems a little squishy to me. But I don't have a better idea right now, so I'm just going to put that out there.
This is Natalie Casey. I agree with you. I mean, I was thinking, I have 2 more years left. Who's going to replace me? What if I don't like that person? What if I don't agree with that person? That's a problem. So I think we need to come back to this.
There's a good point that it does, we don't know what the board's going to look like in 4 years and 8 years, and right.
All right. Well, so, we don't have to decide every single question today, so we come back. We could ask the staff to think about it. We could all think about it. I certainly will think about it, since we're all in coronavirus land and have plenty of time to cogitate on things like what will happen in some number of years if there's crowded schools and an infill impact area. Right.
And so, one thing to consider with that was some of the other suggestions we'd heard about, if not, maybe not this, but if a school is at 120% for 3 consecutive years, then maybe that's the fail-safe, right? Then you do have a moratorium, or if it gets up to 150%. So just a couple of other ideas for you to kind of chew on as you're thinking about this in quarantine.
Why don't we defer that? I cannot resist pointing out that the staff is recommending considering utilization of nearby schools in applying this test, which is an approach that you guys just opposed when we were talking about Clarksburg. So I just cannot help myself but to point that out.
Well, it's not that we entirely opposed it. It's just that the distance question. Here we're just simply saying we'll let you know which the 3 nearest schools. We'll let you know how far they are as well. But when we say within the distance, and that was where we started,
And that was my agreement too. 10 miles is way too far. So distance was my issue. So.
Okay, but we're not going to reopen that conversation.
No, we're not. I
we're not.
Just had to get that off my chest. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Recommendation 4.13. So this is a requirement that when an application comes before you for an extension of their adequate public facilities validity period, that they would be required to have be retested on the school side. The county code currently allows the planning board to require an updated traffic impact study. You don't have to, but there's nothing that says that you require or that you can require even an updated school test. And the thought is that a lot of things change over a period of time, and when a decision was made 5 or 10 years ago, we shouldn't assume that the current conditions still exist, and when they're actually asking for an extension of that adequate public facilities approval. So it would just be a simple reevaluation under the test that exists at that time. We did receive some comments on this. One, in favor, that just recognizing that circumstances can change drastically in 5 to 10 years, and retesting all infrastructure should be mandatory. And MBIA indicated that they were opposed to this, feeling that the provision creates some uncertainty. Yeah. Any comments on this one?
Yes, I guess somebody was citing the 21 years.
Right, so that's the next recommendation.
Okay, you're getting to that. All right,
yeah.
Sorry. All right.
It's related, though. You're right.
Well, here's a thought for you. Not necessarily as an addition to this, but could be done with it or in lieu of it. What if after a certain period the payment could be, is the payment, I don't think the payment is adjusted now. Like if you're 10 years in, you're still paying based on what the rate was at the time it was approved, or am I wrong about that?
No, so for impact taxes, right, so there are a couple of different things at play here. And I'm going to say the same thing you just said, that someone else can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is my understanding of it, and we can even talk to other folks about this to verify. But the impact tax is paid at the time of building permit at whatever rate is applicable at that time. So it's not like a condition of approval. Right?
You don't lock in the rate.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
That's right. So there's already that level of uncertainty for the developer in terms of, when they pull their building permits, that's what impact taxes they pay. They didn't know that when they got their approval, however many years earlier, what that rate would be. But this is not necessarily it's just to retest to see whether or not there's adequate facilities.
Yeah.
But there's a good question, though, with that is that, when 93% of the county doesn't have a moratorium, what are we testing for? So are we now then applying the utilization premium payments to projects that previously had been approved that didn't have that? I don't think we would, because those are being approved as conditions of their initial approval. And so if they're not included in their initial approval, now I'm kind of thinking out loud here for you, that wouldn't be. So the only real place where this would be applicable is in those areas where we still have a moratorium when they get retested.
I don't know. I mean, it might be reasonable to say you got to pay the premium if you've waited around for 7 years plus, and then you finally get around to deciding to build, and now you've got a significantly more crowded school situation. Maybe you should pay a higher rate.
You should pay a higher rate.
Well, that's a good point, because they would be paying the lower impact tax.
But you might have to pay the premium.
Right. So we can make that clear in here in the recommendations to say that they're being retested not just for but that it would also, they're not just being tested for adequacy, but also for, as part of that, the potential addition of a condition of the utilization premium payments.
Yeah, and as you said, because there's not likely to be a moratorium for 93% of the county, that is the implication, not that the project would be stopped, but that it would have to pay more.
Right. Okay.
Could they get the benefit of a reduction? What if they got approved?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And that seems fair too, right? You could.
Yep.
That's right. Yeah, that seems principled to me.
Well, and actually, this is a question that we'll deal with in a little bit here, but I didn't have it in there. But it's the way that we had envisioned those utilization premium payments was that they were going to be, a condition of the approval. So anyone that has their approval today, that's not a condition on their approval. They don't have to make that payment. Now, what we're talking about here is if they come in for an extension, then that would be added onto it, right? But the question is, what payment do they make? Do they make the payment that is applicable at the time of their approval, or do they make the payment at the time of building permit? Our thought had been that the condition of approval would say that you are required to make any utilization premium payment that is applicable at the time of paying your impact taxes or at the time you pull your building permits. So they're not locking it in because it might not make sense to lock it in today because maybe today it's overutilized, but by the time they pull their building permits, it's fine.
Did we get any comments on this?
I'm sorry?
Did we get any comments from?
So on this one, no, not on this in particular, other than the two that you see here. Now it's possible we had a few others.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, I was going to say I bet BIA is not going to like this. You know,
Yeah.
it does create some uncertainty in both directions. I mean, you might come out ahead, you might come out behind, but it
Right.
does mean there's more variability. But again, it's only if you have not pulled a building permit within your validity period.
Right. Yep.
And
That's right.
I mean, you know, usually we're at what, 7-year validity periods right now?
I think it ranges, but yeah, you would probably know better than I would actually.
I mean, I think that's like on the low side, so it could be even more. So if you haven't done anything in 7 years, I think, you know, it's reasonable for the public to say, if conditions have changed after 7+ years, you know, you really ought to expect that you're going to have you might have a different rate applied to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think.
Okay.
So
Are we setting a number of years for this, or?
Well,
after this.
The APF is set in separately, and you know the board can in some cases approve a longer validity period, but there's a default range. I believe that the standard is usually 7 right now. There's projects that have had it extended for 20+ years, like the Rock Spring project, and I think we're going to get a wave of applications and requests for legislative changes at the council in light of the coronavirus for people to have their validity periods automatically extended. So we're going to see, because that's what happened after the last recession, and the council approved that. I think the council may be a little bit more circumspect about that this time based on their experience with the last go-around. On the other hand, there are a lot of new council members, so they may not remember that. But, it happens that it gets extended, and it also happens that people ask us to extend it, and we, in many cases, have discretion to do that. So I think the answer, Natalie, is there are some standards, but there's also a lot of flexibility to make them longer. And I think on the short side, usually you're getting like 7 years, which is a pretty long time.
Right, and recommendation 413 is really only about saying that they would be required to get retested when they come back to you for an extension. It's this next one here, 414, in which we've set a limit to the amount of time that validity period can remain open. So this is, I don't know if you want me to go into this one now.
Well, yeah, I think this is the Rock Spring situation that the council did a few years ago, because the argument was, oh, we're almost there, and then the recession happened and the bottom fell out and we need some more time. And so we'll see what the council does this time around.
Right. Yeah, and so this particular recommendation, the way we've written it right now, it would not include those council mandated across the board extensions. It would only be extensions that they're provided, the original validity period that with the approval, plus any extensions that you provide under Section 43J7 of the county code, which are the ones where they come before you for an extension. And so that 22 years is based on us looking at how, the way it's currently written. The thought would be that originally you can get up to 10 years now on the original validity period, but then there's a clause in there that says you can come for an additional 12 years. And so that's how we came to the 22. The way it's interpreted now, because it's not fully clear, you can get up to, I think, 6 years first on top of your initial 10, and then still get 12 more. And that's why you could get in extensions up to 28 years or so. the important thing to note about this, and some people raised this in some of their comments, is that this, even though we wrote this recommendation in the schools chapter of our report, our recommendation here, it actually would apply to all approvals, so not just residential, and this also applies to transportation APF approval. So the concern that we heard from some people on this is, well, you can see MCPSS supports this. One of the many projects provide public benefits in the form of infrastructure improvements or financial contributions well in advance of their full build out. And in order to get that extension, they need to demonstrate to you that they've made some of those infrastructure improvements. The point, though, is that is only on the transportation side. There is no, but some people will say that, they've kind of earned that right to get that extension because they've been making some improvements, some advancements towards their final product. But there's no equivalent on the school side. So there are a couple of things to think about this year. But obviously other cons are that, a lot of times many larger projects are extremely complex and have multiple phases. And, they just require those longer validity periods. And then there was a kind of some concerns about legacy projects and whether or not it should be applied only to new development approvals and how this gets kind of transitioned in.
Yeah, okay. I'm fine with this. I don't know about anybody else, but anybody else have a contrary opinion? Otherwise, we'll move on. I'm not hearing anything, so I think we're good.
All right. You guys are really impressing me here that we're going to get through everything I wanted to get through, I think. So maybe I shouldn't have said that. Okay. Recommendation 415 also deals with development application review, and this one is to require MCPS to designate a representative to the DRC, the Development Review Committee, to better tie the development review process with school facility planning. And so we've heard a lot about this, ULI, and a lot of people have been pointing to the ULI comments that we need to better coordinate and kind of integrate our efforts with MCPS. This is one way that we can do that, by having MCPS actively engaged in the DRC process for anything that involves residential development, even if it's in an area where there's plenty of capacity. The idea would be that their being at the table gives both agencies the opportunity to better understand what's going on with the other and how it impacts the development application that's in question, but also just the larger area serving that school serves, the school serve. It also gives the developer an opportunity to, to have potential discussions about land dedications, school construction, or other facility improvements that could be performed or paid for by the applicant. Now, MBIA and NAOP supported this. I'm not sure who that second comment is. Oh, that second comment was a comment that we received on numerous emails over the last week or so, this need for systemic alignment between the Planning Board and MCPS. That comment was applied to more than just DRC and development application review, but also just about our planning efforts and our master planning efforts. But and then there was a request from MCPSS to be part of the DRC as well, or at least ensure that their area vice presidents, they have regional vice presidents that they are notified of these development applications as well. There was one concern that we don't have in here about whether or not the types of things that we're recommending in terms of potential land dedications, or I'm sorry, not land, but the facility improvements could actually be done. We can address that when we talk about because we've proposed that as a credit to the impact tax, and that's a question that we can talk to MCPS about whether or not that's even feasible given their current rules. But for here, this is more about DRC. Any thoughts or comments on this one?
Jerry, yeah, in terms of development review, anybody else on there, MCDOT or who,
Oh, yeah.
who
Yeah.
do you have on now?
So
The environmental or department?
right. So yes. So several county executive branch agencies participating in it, as well as utility companies, and the planning director can probably provide a little bit more insight. I've only been, I think, in 2 of these meetings myself, but I would say that it's interesting because MCPS is already identified in the law that establishes the DRC. They're already identified as a reviewing agency, and so they receive all of these, the information on all of these, but they're not necessarily at the table participating in those conversations. And a lot of times, it's because it has no impact on them,
okay.
right? But
yeah.
The point is, like, we want to try to get them more involved. So it's difficult to word this one. How do you require someone to do something when they're already a part of, it'd be easy if we could say, oh, let's add them to it. Well, they're already on it. So,
but maybe it's an alert from you that we have this is coming up. We know there's a school issue. We request that you attend as provided, as currently provided. But
I'm gonna say this is Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. I think this is perfect the way you have it. Require MCPS to be there. We all talk about the need of working closely with them, and this is the great venue for that. And if they're not showing up, that's a problem. And if the solution is to make it a requirement, then that's what's gonna have to be. And I do think it's very valuable to have them on the table. So,
Essie, are you still?
Yeah, I think they should be participants, and unless you excuse them because there's totally no school issue, but they should be part of the process.
Is Essie McGuire still there?
Yes, I absolutely am. And so we absolutely support this and we are happy to participate. I do sort of want to not leave the impression that we were somehow not participating when we were asked to. I think really this is about just, again, strengthening and formalizing that relationship. I think we are very happy to participate and would like to participate. And certainly, again, we're not disregarding invitations. I just want to be clear about that.
thank you.
Okay. I'm not opposed to this, so I think we can move on.
Okay. All right. So the last thing that I'd like to work through today is this recommendation 416, which deals with the utilization premium payments. So we've talked about this a lot, as obviously all of these things are interrelated. So you know what these are. These are in the turnover and infill impact areas when a school's projected utilization 3 years in the future exceeds the established adequacy standards. So the point is, this is in the absence of a moratorium. This is our way of being able to place more of an emphasis on getting the needed infrastructure in areas that are overcrowded, so in most need. Now, to be clear, our recommendation does not indicate that the money generated from this needs to stay in the school or cluster that it's generated for. And part of that is because when we had the school facility payments in the past, that was one of the tie-ups of it, was that we were generating, some money, but it was being in small pockets, being saved in schools that, because they were and it wasn't schools, it was clusters. When the cluster-wide was over 105%, it required a facility payment, and that money stayed in that school cluster. Meanwhile, the school cluster may never get well beyond the 105%. It may never move towards needing a capacity solution, that the money just sat there. So this wouldn't do that. The money would go into the school's CIP and could be used wherever other impact tax dollars and other funding for the capital budget is allowed to be spent. So what this kind of does is it shifts, because in many ways we've made some adjustments to the impact taxes. We've gone from we're recommending going from 120% of the cost to 100%. And then in certain areas we're recommending providing a discount down to 60%, right? So some of those impact taxes are going to be coming down. So what we're doing here is we're shifting the development payment burden less from impact taxes and more towards, these utilization premium payments in areas with the greatest need. So we also proposed very few exceptions to the premium payments or exemptions from it. Or it would only be legacy approvals that were, this is not one of the conditions of their approval, and then the MPDU units. And obviously, like senior housing, they won't have to pay these. But other than that, just the MPDUs. No other exemptions. And just like the impact taxes, they would be calculated on a net impact basis. These are the thresholds. These are the same thresholds that we'd recommended for the in the greenfield areas as the thresholds for the moratorium. So the question before you with this now is if we're recommending increasing that threshold on the in the greenfield impact areas to 125%, does that only apply to moratorium, or does that also apply in the infill and turnover areas to the utilization premium payments? Or do we maintain this, and then do we even apply this threshold in those greenfield areas? So for an area that is at 120%, but it's not yet at 125%, so it doesn't go into moratorium, do we now apply these utilization premium payments? So the other things I wanted to show you is the impact of the two different options. So this was the option that was in the public hearing draft. These were the numbers that we published there in terms of, well, let me first walk through how they're calculated. It's based on the standard impact tax rate, so that 100% impact tax rate that applies in this case, turnover and infill areas. And then we apply a 25% of that if the elementary school is above the thresholds, 15% if the middle school is above, and 20% if the high school is above. I'm not going to walk you through how we came up with these numbers, but they are based on the student generation rates, and it makes logical sense if you think that elementary schools include 6 years worth of students, middle schools only have 3 years worth of students, and high schools have 4. So it's logical why these are the factors. But these are the rates that would apply based on single family, attached, detached, multifamily in the turnover infill areas. And if all 3 levels exceeded, then this is how much would be paid on top of the impact taxes. However, I will point out, based on the current school test, right, that would apply, there are no areas that would qualify for all 3. We do have a few that have the elementary school and high school, but none that also include middle school. And I could show you a map of those after I show you this. This is option B. So this is with those modified impact tax, modified student generation rates because of the adding in those metro station policy areas. Again, it's going back and forth. It's hard to tell what changes, so I've got just to show you here what the impact of that was. And when we get to the impact tax conversation next week, we'll have a similar table showing you how these different scenarios, these different options play out in impact taxes. But you can see in those infill impact areas, the result of adding in those metro station policy areas increased the utilization premium payments on single-family homes by up to $1,000 almost on the elementary school side. In the turnover areas, they came down slightly. So a decent number of comments on this. The recommendation that developers pay utilization premium payments we support, with a few concerns regarding the 3-year window and the amount of the payment. Drop the seat deficit metric. I would say the biggest thing, though, that we've heard on this is that people are telling us that we should use a lower threshold, that we shouldn't be using 120%. When a school gets 120%, it's already well overcrowded. We should be generating the extra funds at a lower utilization level. part of the reason we didn't go to a lower level was that, with those elementary schools and middle schools, then we sort of have the seat deficit. So we didn't want to have too many different things at play here. So we just thought we'd keep it simple. We'd use the same threshold that we use for moratorium for the utilization premium payments. And then some other comments here. So, that it should be triggered in all impact areas. So, yeah. Any thoughts on the utilization premium payments? We've been calling them up payments, too.
Do you have the map that you mentioned?
Oh, yeah,
So
let me do that. Yeah.
And I'm gonna tell you right now, and you have heard me say this before, and even over email. I want to make sure the places where we see that we want growth don't get those crazy impact taxes.
Right.
All these huge fees, and that includes Wheaton. Wheaton needs more redevelopment. Having our headquarters is not enough. A government building does not bring more jobs. You need more than that. And just the fact that the building that was right next to it, you just failed on being built because their numbers didn't work out. It's just one sign of that. So I just need to understand, where are we talking about?
Well, I'm pretty sure my eating out for lunch is not going to sustain all of Wheaton. But I will try my best when we get up there. But okay, so this map that you're looking at here. Now, keep in mind that these utilization premium payments, these are based on the school boundaries, and they would be updated each year as part of the annual school test, right, when we reevaluate the adequacy. So, but this is what would apply under FY21. Elementary school, they're shown here in the white, kind of light gray. Middle school, the only addition is this one here, which is for Argyle Middle School. That's the only one that applies for that. And then high school, when we add high school, you can see there it's kind of across the kind of the Beltway area here. But so there are some areas where we do have some overlap between the elementary school and the and high school, where both would apply. Now, some of these do apply in the areas that you've expressed concern over. Here is the Wheaton area. Now, a couple of points, though, and we'll talk about the specifics of the impact taxes next week and the exemptions on that. But the way we have this defined now, we have a fairly large area that is all part of the now infill area around the CBD here. So they have the lower impact taxes already. And as a activity center, it would be discounted to 60% of those, so they would be even lower. Now, the utilization premium payment, we have no exceptions in here that we've put in. We haven't said that they're discounted in areas that are enterprise zones or former enterprise zones, or however. We've just said this is in lieu of a moratorium. Instead of a moratorium, we've got this additional payment you pay because the schools are overcrowded.
Man, I think everything should match. That's not good.
Well, yeah, I honestly, after 3 hours of this, I'm getting a little fried. I don't know about anybody else. And I also think that it might be useful to consider this in conjunction with the other discussion about, opportunity zones or other places where it might be appropriate to have a discount. So, I think this is useful to see, but at least speaking for myself, I'd rather put this off because I just have run out of ability to focus.
Sounds good. I agree with you.
Okay,
sounds great.
Very good. I thought there might be a consensus on that.
Okay, yeah, Jerry too.
Yeah. Okay, is there anything else you wanted to show us before we conclude, Jason, just for our edification that we could contemplate in our spare time?
Yeah, we'll just try to be ready for next week.
Okay.
All right.
I hope we covered enough ground.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yep. You too.